Hello and welcome back to 35,000 Watts, the podcast. My name is Michael Millard. I'm here with Keith Porterfield and Scott Mobley. We are three college radio alumni, and we like talking about college radio and college radio stuff and college radio music. And today is no exception. But first, I actually have not a correction to last week, but I have an addition to last week's episode. I neglected to give a shout out to Mark Arrett, good friend of ours, been a supporter of the film since the beginning, was a Kickstarter supporter, and has always given us great suggestions for the podcast. And we actually kind of used his idea last week, and I neglected to mention that on the podcast. So thanks, Mark, for your help. Check out Mark's Melody Shack. He's on Facebook. And has a lot of great archives from his days in college radio. So shout out to Mark. Thank you very much, sir. Today we are talking about, I guess, albums that you really, really loved that no one else seemed to get, I think is the best way to put it. I forget exactly how we phrased it when we were kind of talking through, but I think we have three really great choices, three kind of eclectic choices that are going to be fun to talk about. I think we all dug a little deeper on this one to find some gems. And this week we're going to start off with Mr. Keith Porterfield.
Yeah, so on this one this week, we have, over the past few weeks of doing this, been talking about some pretty obscure bands. This is probably the most obscure band that I've mentioned anyway. The band I'm going to talk about today is a band called Tripmaster Monkey. Tripmaster Monkey put out two albums in the 90s. They put out one in 2019, a reunion album. They got back together. These guys are from the Quad Cities. They started out, playing live there, got a pretty big following. Their name, name Tripmaster Monkey, which is, always been one of my favorite band names of all time, actually comes from a novel by a writer called Maxine Hong Kingston. It's the name of one of her novels. Apparently one of the guys was a big fan of that, which is disappointing to me because for all these years, until I looked that up recently, I wanted to think that maybe one of the guys in the band had a pet monkey that, was responsible for doling out the mushrooms and the LSD, and so was the Tripmaster Monkey. But as it turns out, that's not the case. It's just this guy that liked this particular book. So anyway, like I said, they put out two records in the 90s. The first one came out in 1994. It's called Goodbye Race. Based on the popularity of their live shows and all, these guys actually got signed to Sire Records, and so they were on a pretty big label when they got started. Like I said, Goodbye Race comes out in 1994. It is a pretty good album. The one thing I would say about it is that it is very grungy. These guys, they got picked up by Sire. Sire hired them a big time producer to produce the record. And I don't know if it was the producer's fault, if it was the record label's fault, if it was what the band wanted to do, but they were kind of a power poppy band. And this album got produced as though it were a grunge record. It has a very heavy guitar sound to it. It's a little faster and a little lighter than most of your grunge records. You can kind of feel the power pop vibe in there, but it was very much produced like a grunge record. It had a minor hit on it, a song called Shutters Closed that got some MTV airplay. We at KTXT played a song off it called Albert's Twisted Memory Bank, which was pretty good. But overall, it wasn't an album that did real well or anything. We charted it a little bit at KTXT. It had some minor success, but it wasn't huge or anything like that. After that album came out, they toured. Basically, there was some kind of shakeup at the record label, and they kind of lost their support there. Their tour money dried up on them. And so when they got done with that, it came time to record the next album. They really weren't getting much support from the label. And so rather than hire a big-time producer, they got a guy they knew from there in the Quad Cities to do it with them, and basically spent nothing on production. And so since they weren't spending any money, the record label largely left them alone and kind of let them do their own thing. And so the album that came out of that is called Practice Changes, and it sounds absolutely nothing like the first album. The grunge elements are completely gone. I hesitate to call it a power pop album because it's got some more rocky stuff on it as well, but there's a lot of jangly, fast-strummed guitar on this album, and so there's a lot of poppy song structures on it as well. Just a very different thing from what had happened on the first album. They go on tour in support of this. During the tour or shortly thereafter, the label ends up dropping them, so they were right that they were kind of on their last legs after the shakeup at their label. But this album we played some of the songs at KTXT. I really, really like this album, but it just never really got much traction. And the thing is, if you go to listen to this album, the first thing, or one of the first things you'll notice, is that this album's got a 20-song track listing on it, which can be a little intimidating at first. But 5 of those songs, including the hidden track at the end of the album, are all kind of like song stubs, demo level bits of songs that were not really ever fully fleshed out. So if you take all of that stuff off there, you've actually got 15 real songs on the album. And I suspect that the reason all that demo stuff got put on there, I mean, if you got those songs, you might think, well, flesh them out, make a double album out of it, or hold them back, and that'll be the first few songs on your next album. And the only reason I can think that all of that stuff got put on that album is because they probably knew they were about to get dropped by their label. And so they were just trying to get everything that they could out onto something so that somebody was at least going to hear these songs they were working on. For my money, it really clutters up the album. I think it's the one strike against this album is all those little extra song stubs. So if you listen to it the first time through, listen to the whole thing, because, that's the way they recorded it. That's the way they released it, the way they intended it for it to be listened to. But I have to admit, even myself, when I go back and listen to that, I always skip over the song stubs. They just don't need to be there. They really do, to my mind, clutter up the album. But the actual songs on this album are really, really good. The first song on the album, the first song is one of the song stubs, but the first full song on the album is a song called Beyonder. And it is essentially a shoegaze song, like walls of kind of droning guitar, vocals buried deep down in the mix. It's the only song on this album that sounds like that. But man, it is really, really good. So if you're a shoegaze fan at all, check out that song, Beyonder. After that, you get a handful of kind of more poppy, jangle pop type songs. But then you get to a run of 5 songs that, for me, completely makes this album. The first one is called Sprocket Dick. And this is the song that really got me into the album. It's a pop song, but it's a really weird pop song. It's got a little bit of a quieter verse with more of a hardcore chorus. The middle 8 part of it has a violin that comes in and plays for part of the song. It's just kind of a weird one, but man, the guitar riff on this song, the kind of jangly guitar riff that runs throughout it, and the lead guitar line that go over the top of that work really, really well together. And I just loved this song. This was the one that, like I said, got me into it. It's the one that we tried to run at KTXT, tried to give some exposure to, although it really never did take off there. But great song, my favorite one on the album. After that, you got a song called Shirley on Pills, which is a really kind of Pixies-esque tune in that it's got very much has the quiet, loud dynamic going on in it, to the point where, like I say, it would do the Pixies proud. And like I said, it's called Shirley on Pills. It's about a girl named Shirley who, based on her behavior, must surely be on pills. So it's got kind of a funny lyric to go along with the rockin' song. So it's a good one too. The next one after that is called Colts. It's probably the best song on the album. I think if I were to be going back and running the radio station now, that's the song that I would pick for us to run. I think we did Sprocket Dick just because I really liked that song. But I think going back and looking at it now, Colts would have been probably the better radio song on there. Probably the strongest song on the album. Not really a pop song, but really kind of a jangly, mid-tempo guitar rock song. Really good. And it's also got another kind of rocker called Chicago Oranges, another one after that called Fizzle Like a Flood. Those 5 songs right in a row, and I say right in a row, they've actually got a couple of the song stubs stuck in between them. But those 5 songs to me really make up the backbone of the album. And that's the part of the album that really, really grabs me the most. After that, it gets a little more eclectic as you're kind of winding toward the end of it. There's about a 2.5-minute long acoustic country song called You Make Me Cry. That's really good on there. There's one on there called If You Were a Blank, I'd Blank You. It sounds like the whole thing from conception to writing to execution to calling it good took all of about 15 minutes. I mean, it is a really loose, lo-fi song. But I think if they were to have gone in and re-recorded it or done overdubs and tried to slick it up, the charm of the song would have gone away. I think the reason that song is as good as it is because it's so loose and lo-fi and just kind of sounds like a demo that they were working on, and that I thought, you know what, that worked just the way it is. Let's just throw it on there. There's another one that toward the end called Teleport, which is another good kind of rocker that's got a long outro where the violin comes back in and plays some on the end of it. That's one that I really like. So overall, like I said, I really, really, really enjoyed this album. Kind of poppy, kind of rocky, pretty lo-fi and, loose recording. Like I said, gone are all the grunge elements from their first album. Why did this album not get bigger than it did? Why did it not gain any traction either at the radio station or, kind of in a wider sense? I really couldn't tell you. I think the songs are there. I really think part of it was the trouble they were having with their label. Obviously, it wasn't getting a lot of promotion. I also, though, like I said before, I really feel like putting all that extra stuff on there, all those extra song stubs and demo parts and all that really cluttered the record up and probably turned some people off. And I think, they would have been better served to have left all that stuff off of there. To me, some of those little song bits are good, but I would like to have heard them fleshed out. I would like to have heard what they could have done if they'd really worked those songs out. Just having it as a 45-second long little bit of a song just doesn't really work for me. So I think that worked against it. But yeah, I couldn't really tell you why it didn't take off any bigger than it did. I absolutely loved this album. I've played it a lot over the years. I know we were in sending emails back and forth. I don't think either of you guys had heard it since it came out back in the 90s. So I'm interested to hear kind of y'all's take on it after hearing it again after all these years later. But man, yeah, I loved this album. I really wish it would have gotten a little bit better or bigger audience than it did. But what did you guys think about it?
I was trying to remember why I listened to this back in the day and it didn't grab me, and it didn't. I remember you being a big champion of it. I remember hearing it probably only once, I'm going to guess, and I could not for the life of me remember why that was that I went, well, no, not for me. So listening to it again, you mentioned that there are these little sort of snippets on there, these songs that sound unfinished and maybe a demo-ish. On a first listen, I think the whole album kind of sounds like that. And I don't mean that there aren't songs on it, there are, but it doesn't really have a flow from beginning to end, at least not on an initial listen. And I think maybe that's what it was back in the day. As I listened to it, it was too all over the place. It was too unfinished sounding. And so I kind of just dismissed it. Listening to it again, and I gave it several listens this time, it definitely has a lot of individual great songs. And I particularly like, and it's most of the ones you mentioned. I really like Beyonder. I really like Sprocket Dick is the other one. You mentioned those two, and I really like both of those songs. There's several others that I like a lot as well. It's just this album for me doesn't flow from beginning to end. And maybe what you're talking about is the answer, is you take out those little short snippet songs. You take out some of the, for lack of a better word, filler on there. And maybe there is a solid album there. That said, I think this is definitely worth listening to. It's got some great stuff on it. These guys are very musically talented. I think they're great songwriters. I think what you were saying about maybe knowing that the label was done with them and kind of throwing everything against the wall to see if it would stick or not is what this album ended up being. And it definitely sounds like it on an initial listen. But yeah, if you give this one some time, it definitely grows on you. I enjoyed it after listening to it a couple times.
I got confused. It's funny. I wasn't paying attention to the song name, so I was just kind of remembering I really like what I thought was the first song that just had an intro, but that's actually not Car Song Chorus. It's Beyonder is the song that you had mentioned that I caught my ear initially. I was like, well, I can see why Keith likes this album because it is such a shoegaze forward song, but then that's really not kind of what the album is about necessarily. That was my very first thing, because I don't think I've ever actually listened to the album all the way through. I think I'd heard a few songs that you and I played on our internet radio station probably. Certainly, I remembered Sprocket Dick for sure. That was never a song that really super grabbed me, which is maybe why back in the day I wasn't someone that you would consider like a Tripmaster Monkey fan, but I liked it a lot more this time, and I liked it listening to it front to back. Definitely a little disjointed with the stubs. There's a couple that I kind of would love to hear fleshed out. I think that could have been something on another album. I think you're right that the middle section is kind of the strong. It's kind of an interesting album in that it's got almost like a bell curve where I feel like the meat of it's right in the middle, where most albums tend to be more front loaded, I feel like. So that was kind of a curveball too, just as it felt like it got better as you went for a lot of it. I think both of you guys also chose a really, like, you both chose bands that are very, very college radio. Tripmaster Monkey should have been a very big I can see why it wasn't a commercial hit. It doesn't have that song that's just going to jump out on MTV, or at that time even, commercial alternative radio was starting to pick up a lot of steam, and I can see why maybe it didn't break through there. But it really should have been. Like, it's got that eclectic but still upbeat and very radio friendly listenable sound. There's certainly 2 or 3 songs that you could see being on rotation right next to Pavement or Sebadoh or a shoegaze band, Catherine Wheel even, that we'll talk about later. Like, it seems to fit the format really well, but I don't remember it. I guess I was in Lubbock in 96, so I probably was listening to your version of KTXT because you were still there. So what you said about it is I guess kind of my experience with it on college radio, which is that it didn't really take off. I wonder if it did better in other markets, or other college radio stations than it did in Lubbock, but it certainly isn't one that you really hear a lot about. I doubt many people that are listening to this right now have probably heard it, and certainly worth it.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it. I guess you're probably right. I think it is a little disjointed. For my money, that kind of works. I like the eclectic nature of it, but yeah, I can see why that might have turned some people off. And these guys broke up after this. After the label dropped them and after they put this album out, they didn't have any support. They broke up. I did earlier mention that they did come back in 2019 and do a reunion album. It's called My East Is Your West, and if you like anything on Practice Changes, absolutely go check out My East Is Your West. Just a really, really good album that just kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, I didn't know that these guys had released another album until I went back and was doing some looking at this. But yeah, they put out this one more back in 2019. They got back together, like 25 years later, put out an album, and it is really, really fantastic. It's one I would consider to be a power pop album. So if you listen to Practice Changes, if you like anything at all on it, I would highly recommend checking that one out as well.
That's a crazy long gap between albums. I
think these guys have all been participating in other bands. If you look them up, if you read their bios and stuff, they all, this band disbanded, but then they all have been working with other bands and stuff like that. But when you go to Wikipedia, those band names aren't in blue, if you know what I mean. Like, there's no further information. But right. These guys have all been working, for all that time. I guess when you listen to something like this, and it does sound so eclectic and so kind of all over the map musically, I think guys like that are going to find their way back to each other at some point. They're going to go out and do other things. They're going to try things. They're going to go, oh, well, there was that one band I was in where we did all that crazy stuff, and I want to go back and do that again. And I think that's how something like this, how a band like this comes back together.
Well, I kind of teased it a little bit. Next up, Scott has an album from a band that I think is a quintessential college radio band, in my opinion. I'm not sure if everybody has that opinion. Maybe that's why it's on this list. But Scott, you can tell us more about it.
I'm not sure this band's on everybody's list either, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dead Milkmen. They've come up on the podcast before. I know there's some fans out there. This band, for me, has always been sort of my secret shame, I will call it. I have loved these guys since the second I heard them in 1985. I bought a copy of Big Lizard in my backyard. I have followed them pretty much since. That's fallen off a little bit in recent years, but for the first 10, 12 years of their career, I was a huge, huge fan of these guys. And I can honestly say that that's something I don't know that I ever really shared with anybody. I mean, you guys were my best friends for, a good chunk of the 90s. And you probably don't remember me ever talking about the Dead Milkmen because I was secretly listening to them at home. This is a band that I love myself and have a really hard time selling to anyone else. And I might have trouble even selling it to you today. In fact, when this came up, I had a few albums that I had thought of for this, and this is the one I really wanted to do. But in the back of my head, I said, yeah, but I'm going to have to make Michael and Keith listen to it. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. So that's kind of where I'm at. But anyway, so brief history of the Dead Milkmen. Like I said, their first album comes out in 1985. It's called Big Lizard in My Backyard. It has a massive college radio hit on it called Bitchin' Camaro. I'm sure probably most of the people listening to this have at least heard that song in passing, if not pretty familiar with it. That album is labeled as sort of, mid 80s, early punk. I've never really thought of them much as a punk band other than their attitude maybe is punk. Musically, I would put it much closer to rockabilly, probably. They're kind of a jangly pop band that just writes really, really juvenile and silly lyrics. That's kind of the best way to describe them. As their career moved forward, each album got a little more musically proficient, a little tighter. Big Lizard is followed up by Eat Your Paisley, which has two pretty substantial college radio hits on it, Beach Party Vietnam and The Thing That Only Eats Hippies. The album after that in 87 is Bucky Fellini, which has Instant Club hit on it, which was also a college radio jam. Then in 1988, they released the album Beelzebubba, which is in probably, I would say, most of their fans' opinion, their best album cover to cover. The reason I didn't pick that album for this today is because I think anyone that's been around this band, exposed to this band, familiar with this band, they have heard Beelzebubba, the album. If nothing else, you've heard Punk Rock Girl, which is hands down their biggest hit to date. So I didn't do that one, even though it is probably their best album. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm going to talk about the album that follows Beelzebubba. If you need a place to start with these guys, it's probably not the place to start. I would start with Big Lizard in My Backyard or Beelzebubba. But the album I'm going to talk about today is the one that I think is almost criminally underlooked. It comes out in 1989 and is called Metaphysical Graffiti. Now, after this album, they would get signed to a major label. They would flop miserably on that major label. And a lot of people that talked about that at the time said, well, why did they do that instead of just making Beelzebubba 2? Well, they did make Beelzebubba 2, and it's this album, Metaphysical Graffiti. It does not have Punk Rock Girl on it, which is probably why no one heard it when it came out. It does not have a big single. It does not have a big, get this on MTV radio single on it. But it does have, I think, cover to cover, some fantastic songs. Like I said about this band, they are known for really silly, really goofy lyrics. And if lyrics bother you, a song like I Tripped Over the Ottoman is not going to win your heart over.
I tripped over the ottoman one too many times. I tripped over the ottoman until I lost my mind.
It's silly and stupid, and that's exactly what these guys have always tried to be. But if that bothers you, listen to what is going on musically on this album. Songs like I Tripped Over the Ottoman and Methodist Coloring Book, and If You Love Someone, Set Them on Fire.
For a fact, life can really burn you up when you're a pyromaniac. So if you love somebody, better set them on fire. I went to your house last night, decorated me the Human Torch. Got a little pissed at him, so I burned down your front porch. Now I feel a little better about throwing gas on your dad, but you know it's
And you're listening to these titles going, wow, that sounds dumb. Well, it is. But musically, there's some really good stuff going on here. Cover to cover, this is musically probably as good as these guys ever got. Production-wise, it is a really, really fun album, I think, to listen to. It has a lot of different musical styles on it. There's some ska stuff. There's even like a lounge singer number that's kind of good. A lot of jangly pop numbers, some real good rockers. The song that opens this album, Beige Sunshine, is one of the Dead Milkmen's finest moments, in my opinion. And it's also one of the least silly songs they've ever done. It actually has probably some of the most normal lyrics they've ever dealt with. And it is a straight up rocker, just a great song. To those people that maybe fell off with this band after this, because of albums like Soul Rotation and Not Richard But Dick, where a record label tried to convince them that they needed to be more mainstream. They needed to get away from the loud, raucous yelling and screaming they've done before and write pretty songs. And it did fail miserably. They did another great album after Beelzebubba, and it's this one. And so if you haven't heard the Dead Milkmen in a while, if you maybe only heard Big Lizard in My Backyard and Punk Rock Girl, if you never really gave these guys much of a chance, like I said before, you really want to start with Beelzebubba. But if you know that album and liked it, go to the one after it. It's Metaphysical Graffiti by the Dead Milkmen. And now I can't wait to hear what you guys thought after listening to this.
I gotta out myself. Like, I was also secretly a Dead Milkman fan. I was hanging out with you practically every day for years, and we never discovered that. It's kind of hilarious. I love the Dead Milkmen. I really do. Probably not like as much as you, but Punk Rock Girl was my introduction to them. I definitely had not run across them until that song broke on MTV. But that was also right around the time that I first discovered KTXT and college radio, and first kind of discovered this whole other layer of music that was underneath all the pop metal and stuff that I was listening to. So I was kind of starting to reach out and hear weirder stuff. And the one thing I will say is I was always kind of predisposed to being open to weird stuff, because like as a kid I was really into Devo, and I mean, if you're into Devo as a kid, you're pretty much going to be open to anything that gets thrown your way from then on. So I wasn't put off by the lyrics or, you know, the Juvenile, and I was a Juvenile, so that probably spoke to me at that time. His voice is either going to put you off right off the bat or not. I mean, it's kind of like a put on classic punk rock voice, and you're either going to immediately just kind of back away from that or not. If you can get past that and listen to it, I mean, these guys, on the one hand, you're like, well, they're kind of a joke. And on the other hand, you're like, this is as punk as punk. These guys are punk. Like, this is punk. Have you ever met a punk? This is what they're like. I mean, like, this is punk rock. It is unabashed. A couple of guys being stupid and silly, but also I would argue that there are some really good kind of deep lyrics on this album. If you go back to like Big Lizard in My Backyard, probably not so much, but like this album has really great, like Methodist Coloring Book. I mean, I'm probably going to play a clip from it right now. But that line, because God hates war and God hates crime, but he really hates people who color outside the lines. That's freaking deep, man. That's not Juvenile at all. Like, I love that. This is them probably at the peak of their, right around the time where they were really, everything was coming together for them. Yeah, what can I say? I don't know if that's surprising to hear, and I don't know how many people agree with me. I don't know if Keith agrees with me. We're about to find out. But I'm disappointed that I hadn't heard this album sooner. I have to say, I had Big Lizard, I had Beelzebubba, and then I had Death Rides the Pale Cow, which is kind of a compilation. So I knew a couple songs off of this. I didn't really know the album front to back until today when I listened to it, and it really is great. Like, I'm sure there's people that aren't going to be able to make it through or that aren't going to like it, but for certain people out there that maybe haven't heard it, you're going to love it, and you're going to absolutely wonder why you hadn't been listening to the Dead Milkmen your whole life.
The Dead Milkmen was kind of a blind spot for me. I didn't really know much about them other than Punk Rock Girl. I used to play that on retro radio back in the day. That was really kind of the only song I knew. So I was going into listening to this album, pretty much just without a whole lot of expectation or a lot of background on these guys. When we had been talking about this, we'd been talking about it as albums that you got that no one else got. And, I have to admit, after listening to this one, I don't get it. It just didn't do a whole lot for me. It's not terrible. There are some good songs on it. You guys mentioned most of them. I really liked Methodist Coloring Book. If You Love Somebody, Set Them on Fire is great. Dollar Signs in Her Eyes is probably my favorite song on the album. I really liked I Hate You, I Love You. All of those were good. But yeah, overall, you guys have both described it as being really punk and not terribly punk. I think it's really punk in aesthetic, but not as much so maybe in music and execution. I think there is a little more, eclecticism going on there than just kind of straight punk rock. But yeah, I have to admit, the lyrics did bother me. They really didn't do anything for me. The guy's voice didn't do anything for me. So overall, this was not something that I would want to pop on and listen to a lot. But like I said, there were songs on it that I thought were really good. And I can understand why, people would get into them. And if you're not bothered by the guy's voice and the kind of some of the silly lyrics, and if you like the kind of fast-paced, poppy, punky kind of stuff, absolutely check it out. Just because it wasn't for me doesn't mean it's not going to be for everybody else. But yeah, for me on this one, I have to admit, I was not a huge fan.
You bring up some interesting stuff, and I kind of knew this one wasn't going to be for you, and I'm not sure why I knew that, but I just kind of did. I just kind of knew that it wasn't going to be up your alley. I really don't know that it's going to be up a whole lot of people's alleys, but the point of this was, is it up mine? And it is. I wanted to point out something about the vocals for the Dead Milkmen, because they do have two vocalists. One of them is the sort of gravelly voiced punk rock voice that you hear on, I would say, most of the songs. The other one is, the guy's name is Joe Gennaro. The first guy's name is Rodney. He goes by Rodney Anonymous. He has a real name, and I forget what it is. Joe Gennaro is the singer of the two. He's the guy that sang Punk Rock Girl. He's the guy that sings the one you mentioned, Keith, the Light in Her Eyes, or whatever that is, on Metaphysical Graffiti. I forget the
Dollar Signs in Her Eyes.
The ballad that's toward the end, yeah. He's the one singing that. This is where the Dead Milkmen went wrong after this album, is all of their albums up until this point have both of them doing vocals. One song here, one song there, all kind of on and off, sometimes together, but rarely. Someone decided, and probably because of the popularity of Punk Rock Girl, that's the voice the Dead Milkmen needed to have, was that guy. Soul Rotation, the album that followed this one, is 13 songs that all sound like that song. It's him singing. It's a little slower. There's no rockers on it. It's just a bizarre album. And for a band that had really built what was granted a limited and maybe cult following, they just completely threw that out the window and tried to record a pop album. They've honestly never recovered from it. They've put out 3 albums since the 2 major label ones that flopped. They've put out 3 albums since then. They're all pretty good. They all kind of sound more like this and Beelzebub, but they've just never gotten any traction because they just completely abandoned everybody by giving up what was a pretty good dynamic. Neither one of these guys are Pavarotti, but they had a nice, sort of, this is the screamy punk guy and this is the singer guy, and we're going to work those two things together and bounce off each other. And they came up with this really unique and interesting sound that, granted isn't for everybody, but it was at least theirs. And then they just completely threw that out the window and tried to record a pop album. And, if nothing else, when they're both going at the same time, you really get a feel for those almost comical Philadelphia accents these guys have, which is also part of their sound and really what makes them, I think, a unique and interesting band. And so every album up until this point, I will recommend as something that sort of carries that on. After that, you're on your own. Soul Rotation is a weird animal. And even as a big Dead Milkmen fan, I can honestly say I don't think I've listened to it since it came out, and I have no desire to ever listen to it again. But
you really get the Philly accent on Cousin Earl, the last song on the album, which has kind of got the spoken word deal where he's talking about Earl and all his travails. That one's actually really funny.
That thing where they do the sort of obviously improv, little interspersed things throughout the album. They did that on Beelzebub and this album as well. So that sort of became a thing for a minute. They got rid of it afterwards, but you could tell they just got in the studio and started banging away on their instruments, and Rodney would just talk into the mic and whatever came into his head. Some of it's hysterically funny. It's not the most politically correct stuff you've ever heard in your life, but it's really funny.
No, it is.
I mean, much like the intro to Bitchin' Camaro. I mean, that's like one of the
exactly.
famous songs has that same just telling a story. And you could tell it was a one-take shot. Like, they didn't go back and redo that intro.
They even, like in Bitchin' Camaro, the version that you can hear recorded, there are obvious mistakes in it. They switch characters at one point. Like the guy that's going to the shore is all of a sudden the guy that's asking the other guy about going to the shore, and they laugh. That was obviously one shot. Throw this out there. I said this to somebody the other day, and it's really true. That part of Bitchin' Camaro is why Bitchin' Camaro is popular. The song Bitchin' Camaro that follows it is totally forgettable. It's 45 seconds of nothing. It is the intro to that song that made it the song that it is. It made it popular. And so, they kind of carried that through. And those little spoken word things, they are ridiculous, but they're also kind of funny too. Classic
college radio band. And oddly enough, I shouted out Mark Arrett earlier because he gave us a suggestion for the podcast episode. He has a good story about the Dead Milkmen, so you can go and check out his interview after this one. If you want to learn more about them, he had a good story. Yeah, very fun band. And that leaves me. with my band and my choice for or albums that I like that other people didn't get. I think you guys probably did a better job of choosing than I did. After I was listening to this and kind of looking up some of the press and stuff, I think a lot of people did like this album, but it still feels like one that I loved. That was probably in my top 2 or 3 of the year. So it came out in 97, Catherine Wheel, Adam and Eve. But it's not one that anyone ever talks to me about or mentions to me. It just doesn't come up in conversation a lot, or never did. And so I guess maybe I have the perception that it wasn't as appreciated as it should have been or could have been. Catherine Wheel had 3 previous studio albums plus a compilations album, and I think we're kind of they're a UK band, obviously, so some of it is always that they were much bigger in the UK than in the States. I think they had a pretty solid run on college radio. I know they did at KTXT, and we played songs off of all the albums. Judy Staring at the Sun was a pretty big breakthrough hit that probably got played on most college radio stations in the country, I would say, and I think got some MTV airplay as well. So it's not like they're an unknown band, but it's not just one of those names that instantly comes to mind when you think of 90s alternative rock bands. By the time you get to 97, in my opinion, it's kind of where alternative rock starts to eat itself a little bit, and you start to, you have, on the one hand, you have albums like this coming out, and Radiohead, OK Computer, but on the other hand, your Smash Mouths and your Sugar Rays of the world are starting to also get airplay on the same alternative radio station. So alternative is getting more commercial. It's starting to lose, I think, a lot of its edge, and so maybe that's why this album kind of stood out to me. That here's this band that already kind of has a pedigree, that put out what I think is the best of their career. I think they're at the height of their powers at this point. I think the songwriting, the production, everything comes together on this album, but yet I don't think it's really necessarily the one that got the most attention. Or I feel like from a college radio perspective and from an audience perspective, they were maybe on a downhill slope, whereas quality wise, I feel like this is kind of the pinnacle. So there's this, kind of mismatch between where I feel like they were quality wise and what kind of audience they were gathering, or what kind of airplay this record got. To me, it drops off a little at the end, although Scott and I were briefly talking before we started recording, and he likes it all the way through, and I think it is solid all the way through. But I will say that I think the first 7 or 8 tracks are the best. To me, they're showing off so much that they have a song called Satellite on here that has not 1 but 2 absolutely beautiful choruses. It's got this great verse, and then it goes into the chorus, and you're like, damn, this is a good song. That's a great chorus. And then there's a whole other chorus that's just as good right after it. They're like, we're just blowing chorus. We're blowing through courses now. We can stick 2 in this song. But love Satellite. Delicious was, I think, the big single off of this, if big is the right word, which I don't necessarily think it is. You did hear Delicious a little bit on commercial radio, I think. I personally love, I like the intro. I love Future Boy, which is the first kind of real track on there. I love My Solituda, and Satellite to me is the highlight of the album. But I think both of you guys are familiar with Catherine Wheel in general, but I don't really kind of remember talking to you guys about this specific album. And I'm kind of curious, did it drop off your radar at this point? I think all of us were just out of college radio, by a year or 2, but some of us were still working in commercial radio or in clubs or doing whatever. So yeah, I was kind of wondering, did this cross your path? Were you kind of keeping up with Catherine Wheel, or is this kind of your first time going back and listening to it?
I came to Catherine Wheel a little bit late. I didn't get into them heavily when they were popular, at the radio station. I knew some of the songs, obviously the ones that we played, but then after the fact, I ended up buying Chrome and Happy Days both, which I also really liked those albums. It's funny on this one, because when I was going to listen to it, I wasn't sure that I'd ever heard it all the way through from end to end. And yet somehow in my Apple Music library, I have 7 of these songs that I cherry picked at some point or another. I wasn't sure exactly how that had happened. So I went and listened to the album, listened to it all the way through. And now I know why I have 7 songs off of it, because for my money, there are 7 utterly fantastic songs on this album. And then there are also 5 other songs on this album. And so at some point or another, I had listened to it and went and cherry picked the ones that I liked off of it at some point, But I will say, man, when this album is on, it is just incredibly on. The 7 songs that I'm talking about that I liked on it are really, really, really good. And you mentioned Satellite, which is probably my all-time favorite Catherine Wheel song. All of them, though, I mean, just the ones that you hadn't mentioned yet that I like. Phantom of the American Mother is a fantastic song.
If Superman and Sonic Youth are fairy tales, it's time to face the truth. You'll throw your life away as the woman dressed as Baby Jane, like a phantom of the American mother.
Here Comes the Fat Controller is a fantastic song. When this album is on, it is on to a degree that is almost impossible to state. I mean, these songs are really, really good. And then, like I said, the other 5 songs on it do absolutely nothing for me at all. So at some point in the past, I listened to this album and cherry picked the ones I liked. But man, yeah, hard to beat this album when it's on.
So, Michael, I told you before we started recording that, we had 3 albums to deal with this week, and you won, hands down. This is just a fantastic record. And my history with the Catherine Wheel is that, I loved Chrome when it came out. I really, really loved Happy Days when it came out. That album was right up my alley. Now, if you look at, these guys' sort of history, that is considered their most rockin' album. So naturally, that's the one I was going to gravitate to. Why I did not ever hear this album until this week, I can't tell you. I don't know how this band fell off my radar. I don't know why I didn't know that this album existed. But wow, this is just a phenomenal record. I was just blown away at how something so good, cover to cover, for me. I'd be curious, Keith, to hear the 5 songs you don't really like, because I don't think I have any. I mean, there's some I like more than others, obviously, but there's really nothing on here that stands out as something that I would skip. I mean, I just think this is cover to cover one of the best albums we've talked about, honestly. And you mentioned Future Boy, Keith. You mentioned Phantom of the American Mother. That one I really liked. Satellite, we've all mentioned, and that obviously I think is the gemstone in this album's crown. But I really liked the 2 sort of epic sonic tracks at the end, Goodbye and For Dreaming. I like both of those quite a bit, actually. They're a little bit longer, more sort of sonic, soundscapey songs that maybe, when these guys get lumped in with shoegaze, that's kind of what they're talking about, I think, is these guys do have the ability to do those sort of long, sonic, epic, shoegazy sounding songs. Although this album is not that. It is pretty much a straight up rock album that's a little mellower maybe than these guys were known for being, but man, at a fantastic result. This is one that I am really disappointed was off my radar for so long, because I have found a new album to enjoy. This is a really good one.
Yeah, it's the intro and the outro are 2 of the ones that I'm, not a big fan of. And they're just kind of throwaway pieces at the beginning and ending of it, or at least they seem throwaway to me. I don't want to insult the Catherine Wheel guys for calling their stuff throwaway, but those 2 obviously were not, just you can tell by the production on them, everything, were not meant to be like kind of the lead singles on the album or anything. The 2 longer ones you mentioned, Goodbye, For Dreaming, are 2 of the ones that I was not a big fan of, although of those 2, I like For Dreaming better. And then Thunderbird was the other one that I didn't care for just a whole lot. But yeah, everything else on that album is like an A+ song. It's really amazing that there's 7 just fantastic songs on it, and then like I said, the rest of it really didn't do much for me at all.
Yeah, I don't know how
it also comes right after Satellite, so I mean, they could have put Stairway to Heaven there. You might be disappointed.
Yeah, also true. Yeah.
I mean, how Satellite wasn't a breakout hit, I really don't know. Why this album wasn't marketed better, I really don't know, because I think, like I said, 97 was a weird year, so I don't know, maybe. And Catherine Wheel did have, kind of a reputation, I think, of being a shoegaze band. Their earlier albums definitely are more samey in the terms of, I don't think they have the diversity that this album has. They don't, this album, they slow down a little bit. I think they pull back that wall of sound guitar, and it lets the melodic kind of nature of the instrumentation really shine, and it lets their songwriting shine more. But I think the songwriting is also better on this album than it is on some of the earlier albums, which I love. And there's hints of this also on like Cats and Dogs, which is their B-sides compilation, where you hear some of the songs that didn't make the albums, and so they don't necessarily fit that mold. That, like, I feel like if you listen to Chrome front to back, you have some upbeat songs, some slower songs, but its wall of sound, it feels like just all the way through. It's just pummeling you with sound, for the vast majority of the album. And this album doesn't do that. It's much more varied, just more thought put into the production and into the instrumentation, and I think they let themselves put those songs on the album. Whereas if you listen to like Cats and Dogs, you hear like, oh, they were capable of doing this before, but they held those songs back, or they felt like they shouldn't be necessarily, featured on an album for whatever reason. And it felt like they must have felt like they had permission to put those kinds of songs on the album, because Adam and Eve has that yin and yang, which is what I think was missing from their earlier albums. One of my all-time favorite albums, probably one of my top 10, I think, all time.
I think that, a lot of times when a band that's known for sort of big sonic production strips that back, it's not always a good thing. It usually kind of goes the other way. I think in this case, it actually maybe is a little bit of an improvement. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a better album than the ones before it, but it's so different for them. It sounds like them, but it doesn't kind of at the same time. But I wanted to just mention this really quick because it really stuck out to me. In 1997, when this album comes out, Big Takeover magazine, which I'm not familiar with, but this was quoted on their bio, names this the number one album of 1997. Number 2, OK Computer by Radiohead. So the critics heard this,
It's a big swing.
Yeah, they just didn't do a very good job of letting me know it was out there, I guess. But yeah, this is a good one, guys. Give it a listen if you haven't.
And we should also note that, we're talking about their maybe dialing the guitar back a little bit on this album. It has still got a lot of heavy guitar on it. It's not to say that this is suddenly like an acoustic folky album or anything like that. I mean, there are some loud guitar songs on this album. So if you're a fan of early Catherine Wheel, loud stuff, there's still going to be some stuff on here that you're going to like.
It's just a little less of that shoegazy production, that sort of, listen to all these crazy distortion sounds going on behind this wall of guitars. It's not that. It's a little more stripped down. But yeah, I think maybe we were giving the impression that this is a mellow album. It isn't. It's just produced a little differently than what they did before it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of the songwriting may have been there, but it was obscured by just a very, very thick wall of guitar sound that isn't there. But that isn't to say that guitars aren't there and rock isn't there. Yeah, it's that very specific kind of thing that they were doing. So yeah, absolutely. Catherine Wheel is a great band just to dive into their catalog in general. They only had one more album after this, and then they hung it up. So it's not like a deep catalog. So kind of like Trip Master Monkey, they have just a handful of little gems that you can go listen to. All three of these, though, another great chance to go. And if you haven't experienced, I'm going to guess a lot of people haven't experienced Trip Master Monkey. just guessing that's probably the case. So I'm hoping that there's some people out there that are going to go check that out. I think probably familiar with Dead Milkmen, but maybe not that particular album, Metaphysical Graffiti. So if you maybe dropped off of Dead Milkmen, or you're only familiar with Beelzebubba, I highly recommend listening to that album. Again, it's hit or miss. It's I love it or hate it kind of album probably, but definitely
it's for you or it isn't. That's it.
You'll know probably 2 songs in if you're gonna want to.
You will know by track 4 if you're gonna like the album or not. That's pretty safe to say.
Yeah, but definitely worth it. And Catherine Wheel, I think is probably the most accessible of the 3, and probably the one that will catch your ear, but also maybe one that you're already familiar with. So if not, go check it out. Thanks for listening. We have a lot of fun doing these podcasts, and we appreciate you guys listening in. Make sure you let us know what albums that you really dug that no one else did on our social media or on our webpage. Some fun stuff. We are thinking about working on an episode where we try to defend your list of Alien and Abduction albums. So if you haven't heard the Alien Abduction episode, it's basically desert island discs, but with the caveat that you're abducted from a certain place in time, and in this case it's your college radio booth, so you can only grab like what's in the booth with you, so you're kind of limited to what would have been in college radio airplay at the time you were in college radio. It's a fun episode, and we're thinking that we might take some suggestions from our listeners. We already have some, but if you want to give us some list of things you would take, then we might try to defend those ourselves. That was a fun idea that Keith had, and so we need a couple more lists of albums that you would take with you if you were going to get abducted. I think we let you do 5 albums, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was 5.
Yeah, so let us know on social media. That'll be a fun one to do. Once again, thanks to Scott and Keith for joining me on the podcast, and thanks to everyone out there. Join us next time on 35,000 Watts, the podcast.